All right, here we go. I'm testing out some new technology that I've never used before. So, testing, 1, 2, 3. How do I make this move forward? I'm going to be lecturing to, what is it, Chapter 9 on Special Offenders, but I'm also kind of testing out some new technology, so I apologize if I screw some stuff up. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for being willing to watch this. I'm going to hit the next little arrow button and hope that moves this PowerPoint. And it didn't. Okay, so how do I get that to move? Oh, there we go. Okay, so special offenders. There we go. Offenders whose circumstances, conditions, or behaviors require management or treatment outside of the normal approach to supervision. So what we're talking about here, as far as correctional facilities, correctional institutions, correctional agencies is concerned, is that pretty much any type of need that a human being could possibly have, whether it's physical health, mental health, disability, anything, sickness, illness, maybe they're tested positive for coronavirus or something crazy like that. So there's all kinds of interesting scenarios that could take place. There's all types of different offenders that a correctional facility is going to have to learn how to manage and care for. So we're not talking about your average healthy criminal. We're talking about maybe the 80-year-old man who's still in custody for, murdering 15 people, but now he's 80 years old and he has other issues like cancer, like he needs glasses, he needs crutches, he needs a wheelchair, whatever it is. So we're talking about that group of people inside a correctional facility that need more services than just the average person. So I'm going to try and click this again and hope it goes. Yay! Okay, so it says juvenile offenders in an adult criminal court. I'm not sure if you can see that or not. But there are some instances where a juvenile, that means a person under the age of 18, could end up in the adult criminal world. And in California, that juvenile must be at least 16 years of age and have committed what we call a serious violent felony, strikeable offense, 707B offense. I know there's a bunch of different names for it, but basically a serious violent felony. There is a court proceeding. There are procedures in place for this to happen. The first one is called a waiver or a fitness. A waiver or a fitness is a process that goes through the juvenile courts where the judge in the juvenile court will assess whether or not a juvenile is suitable for juvenile court or should go on to the adult world. And this is a court proceeding that takes place fairly frequently when we have juveniles who are going to possibly go into the adult world. So that's one way. Another way is direct file. The DA's office or the prosecution they do have the ability to file charges directly into the adult court if the minor has committed a serious violent felony and he is at least 16 years of age. I hear somebody coming around the corner. They're listening to me. I'm sure recording myself. So there are some statutory exclusions, but we're going to go on to the next page. You know what? We're going to pause for a second because my daughter is standing here, but I don't remember. Alt-P? Alt-P. Okay, here we go. Blended sentencing is a middle ground between juvenile and adult sentences that allows for a judge to choose from a broad array of both juvenile and adult sentences. I see this very infrequently. In fact, I don't know that I've ever seen this before throughout my career of working in the juvenile courts. Then straight adult incarcerations. Juveniles can be handled by the adult court and placed in. There should be a space there, but placed in adult prisons with no separate housing or differentiation in programming. Okay, so as far as I'm concerned, and everything that I've ever seen throughout my history of working with juveniles and in the court system, is that a juvenile cannot be locked up in sight or sound of an adult. So what we would have to do in California for juveniles is we would have to house them separately. Even if they were charged as adults, convicted as adults, we would still have to hold them separately until they're at least 18. So this is something different that your book talks about, but this is not the way we do it in California. Okay, next. Oof, did I just go blended sentencing? Oh, look, it's working now. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. This happens a lot. The first little bullet point here. Typically, the juvenile is going to stay in a juvenile facility until they're 18 if they have been tried as adults. And then once they turn 18, they're going to get transferred into an adult facility. So that's typical. And then the segregated incarceration. This is what we do in California. Juveniles who are dealt with in the adult system have to be completely separate from all adults in that facility, other than staff, of course. So you know what I mean. Adult offenders. Okay, next slide. Yes. Okay. We have, as you can imagine, there are a lot of prisoners with substance abuse issues. Between 63 and 83% of offenders are under the influence of some type of drugs. So what do we do with those types of offenders? We assess them to see how significant their drug history is. We treat them and then we monitor them. By treatment, they're typically going to go to substance abuse treatment programs. And monitoring, I know you're like, why would we have to monitor people while they're in prison? Because somehow they get drugs in there. So anyways, they do have drug testing in prisons because unfortunately drugs get in there. Mentally ill offenders. This is a significant issue, certainly in California and certainly in this date and time. We have a lot of mentally ill offenders between our jails, prisons, throughout the criminal justice system. So the goal is to try to treat them while keeping the community safe. You can imagine this is a tricky one. Yeah, you see a lot of mentally ill offenders in juvenile and adult facilities. They are more likely to remain incarcerated as opposed to getting released, and typically that's because of the lack of stability. Disproportionately abused, beaten, and raped. Much likely to become more sick in custody. Much sicker? Is that a word? Sicker? Much more sick? Anyways, much more ill in custody. They're more likely to be in solitary confinement because their behavior sometimes is unstable. They're more likely to commit suicide, more likely to reoffend, and they are more expensive to house. Why would they be more expensive to house? Because we've got to keep constant watches and things like that on mentally ill offenders. So there's a lot of reasons. We do, great, now my phone is ringing. Anyways, I have a home phone. I know, crazy, huh? Okay, medical parole. This is the concept of letting someone out of a facility so that their family can take care of their medical needs. This is typically going to be somebody who has very significant health issues. Compassionate release is a whole other deal where people would request that the court release them from custody because it's the compassionate thing to do and let them die at home with their families. Very uncommon, doesn't happen very much, but it is something that does happen. Now my dog is wandering around. He needs to go out. Okay, I'm going to pause this again. Alt-E. Okay, now I let the dog out too. Okay, so what are some other issues that elderly offenders end up having to deal with? And age, health issues. We have entire prison sections of prisons where it's just a hospital and it's a place where people, elderly people, aging offenders are basically waiting to die. A lot of them are being treated for cancer and any other horrible disease you can think of. So it's obviously very expensive. It's something that ends up costing the taxpayers a lot of money. But what are you going to do? Can't really throw them out anyway. So there's a lot. They also get abused quite frequently in custody. So that's another issue with aging offenders. Is this the last slide? I think it must be. Oh no, violent offenders. Okay, violent offenders. Obviously, in prison, certainly in California, since there are only serious violent felons in California prisons, violent offenders are more costly because they fight and we have to pay for staff to supervise and make sure they don't kill each other. So they're more expensive to house because they require more supervision. And, oh, sex offenders, yay. Sex offenders. Anyways, this is another group. These are people who are in custody who have committed sex crimes, whether that be against juveniles or adults, maybe a rapist or child molester. They are definitely a different crowd to supervise. Their needs are different. A lot of them are very compliant to a certain extent with what they're supposed to be doing, but they're shady and sneaky too at the same time, and they become victims in custody, so they have to be watched a little more carefully. A pedophile is someone who is sexually attracted to and molests children. Yes, as you can imagine, these are they're the lowest of the low. We also call them chomos for child molester. That's what they call them in the jails and prisons. So these are other types of offenders that we might have to supervise. How do we treat them? A lot of times it says treatment and management of sex offenders. I'm not sure if you can see that whole part right there on my screen. But that's what it says. So victim-centered, a lot of what they're dealing with is trying to basically have the sex offender acknowledge that he did something wrong, which is like big step number one for them. And people who treat sex offenders and work with sex offenders have to understand how sex offenders work, because they're a different group of people. Monitoring and evaluation, monitoring a violent offender is one thing, but monitoring a sex offender is completely different, because you're looking at, have they been online? Have they been, I don't know. Monitoring them is different. It's been a long day. Anyways, okay, move forward. Civil commitment. Okay, so I want to tell you a story about a time I went to visit the California Youth Authority, is what it used to be called at that time. It is now CDCR-DJJ. That's California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, Division of Juvenile Justice. So it's like a prison for kids. And we went, I think it was a court holiday, so we all went and did a tour, and we met with the sex offender group. And one of the sex offenders agreed to talk to us and tell us about his experience at CYA and all that kind of stuff. And ultimately what he told us was, I am 24 years old, I'm going to max out at 25, they're going to have to release me, and I am pretty much 100% certain that I'm going to go out and molest again as soon as I get out. He wasn't being a jerk. He was scared. Like, he knew. He said, I'm not fixed. I'm not better. So it was really kind of like an eye-opener. So what do we do with people like that? I know. I was like, well, he's vaxxed. He's timing out at 25, and he's going to be 25 in 6 months or whatever. So there is something called a civil commitment, where the DA's office or the prosecution can file a motion with the court to ask that the offender be deemed a sexually violent predator, and he could do 2 more years in custody, and then have that status be reviewed every 2 years. That makes sense? So they're being committed for an additional 2 years over their maximum period of confinement because they're deemed sexually violent predators. Now, this doesn't happen very often either, but it is something that can happen. It did happen with that guy, which made us feel a little bit better. What else? Offenders with infectious diseases. So while you work in a correctional facility, you basically, actually any time of the day, whether you work in a correctional facility or not, you basically have to assume that everybody has AIDS, tuberculosis, hepatitis, or the coronavirus. So working with those types of offenders is tricky because you need to protect yourself. And it is also, as a correctional officer, it's your responsibility to not share that information with others because of HIPAA laws. So if an offender has HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, hepatitis, mumps, something recently that we had at the Fresno County Jail, and now coronavirus, things like this, dealing with them is different as well, because in certain instances they have to be housed separately, they have to be quarantined. You have to be extra cautious with them because, granted, you should assume that everybody you're dealing with has hepatitis or whatever. So always have your gloves, masks, whatever it is that you would normally wear to protect yourself. So these are definitely another type of offender that you have to be aware of all the time. And that's it. So here's what I'm going to do. I expected that you're going to watch that whole video. So I want you to post a comment that says Fernandez has a dog named Juju, Juju, and I'm going to give you 5 points extra credit for watching this. Thank you. How do I stop it now? I gotta figure that out now. Now, stop. I don't know how to stop it. I don't want it to record. Oh, here we go. Stop.